everyone. Welcome to another study of Why I Don't Believe, in which we will be discussing the religion of Odinism, also known as Asatru. Now, you may notice already that I'm failing to pronounce some of these to a T, and for that, I can't offer much of an apology because it makes no difference. We're here to discuss the substance of these claims, not necessarily the eloquence of their presentation. So, regarding this topic and the reasons I have not only to believe Christianity, which have been discussed before, but also the reasons I don't believe other religions, understand first and foremost the intentions of these videos. First, that I am making these claims not only out of respect for these views and giving them a fair chance at bat to present the information they have, to compare it to what I know about reality, and ultimately to come to conclusions about whether or not I am on the wrong or right side. I've given the chance to go through all of the material that Odinism would have to offer in its core claims, and then coming to conclusions about it. I'm giving it a fair shot to prove whether it is true or not. The second intention of these videos is to encourage a conversation. While those listening to or watching these videos may have reasons apart from those presented to believe Odinism, I would like to engage with you on this common platform and hopefully be able to not only learn things for myself in engaging with those who have the Odinist or Zoroastrian or Muslim or Hindu belief, but then also give you the chance to hear my side as well. But none of that will be discussed in this video, because understand that while I do believe, according to 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5, that there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus, I do want to make sure that I at least am consistent. In claiming that one belief is true, I am doing so at the expense of all others. And I don't want to make that claim lightly. So let's take the time to go through the belief of Odinism in the most surface level and fundamental terms possible, and find out if the core claims, going down to the roots, and not discussing whether or not there are evil Odinists like Anders Breivik, or there are nice Odinists like, say, my cousins and relatives who also share my Norse heritage. We're here to discuss whether this is in line with reality, because truth is simply that, telling it how it is. Does Odinism fall in line with that? Because understand, the standard of any belief should be to hold it to the standards we'd hold to any other worldview and determine if it's consistent, coherent, and clear. Given my Viking heritage, which I am very proud, I would want to know the truth above my own preferences, and I would have to then ask the question, are the gods of my own ancestors real? Is the religion of Odin the true religion? Well, let's look at the facts. The history behind Odinism, also referred to as Asatru, is that the Eddas, and again, pronunciation or not is Eddas in English lettering, make up the traditions passed down orally through Norse culture. They put the traditional poems into a single codex, which is known as the Regius Codex, or the King's Book in English, from the 11th to the 14th century AD. So this would be, of course, post-Christian era, but nonetheless are claimed to have been dated before the time of Christ. Not the written material, but the source material, of which we have no reason to object, at least in concept. We'll grant that this was something that was worshipped and celebrated and at least understood at a fundamental level, which is why we're just sticking to the basics, by the Vikings during the time of Jesus and before. But understand this as well. These 29 poems that ultimately make up the Eddas are the foundational material for all that Odinism is based on. I can't really go into more history because it just simply isn't there. We could talk about how other Vikings talked about this, but we don't exactly have written material for that until this time. So this is what we have to go on. Likewise, the Eddas themselves are the oral tradition that would go back thousands of years, containing knowledge of the afterlife, the nature of the universe, and the ones in charge of both. Thus the nature of the gods, the idea of the realms, and of course where you will ultimately spend your existence after you leave this body and this earth. Now, the first key, not only assumption about the nature of the universe, but also with mankind himself, is that man is basically good. that we share the nature of the gods to a point that the gods live within us in a way, and that lining yourself up with the nature and desire of each will make you a co-worker of theirs, an associate, a helper, to follow their agenda in the next life as much as this one. Now, this agenda that they wish to follow would fall in line with their nature, and we'll test that in a moment. But the second and most important claim that Odinism would make, that we're going to address in the study, is the concept of the universe having created itself naturally over time through the melding of pre-existing matter. And according to the Eddas themselves, it was the merging of Niflheim and Muspelheim in Guingagap, which in basic English terms is the realm of cold and the realm of fire met in nothing to produce Ymir, who was the first giant. Now, let's see if these claims can stand up to scrutiny. Are they consistent? Well, unfortunately, no. The concept of Guingagap is either true or it's false. If there is nothing, we mean that there is nothing. If there's something, the question then remains how it got there. And thus, the fundamental nature of this religion isn't telling us our origins, it's just merely observing a method of speculation, which we'll repeat here in a moment. The claim made in the Eddas takes for granted that fire and ice were a part of the northern and southern regions of Guingagap. All the while, the presence of burning or chilling requires chemicals in this Guingagap reacting in this time, which are indeed something. According to Voluspo, Voluspo, chapter 1 and verse 3, we read, "Of old was the age when Ymir lived, sea nor cold waves nor sand were there. Earth had not been, nor heaven above, but a yawning gap," this is where that is translated from, yawning gap or Guingagap, "and grass nowhere." So the question then is the claim of Odinism that chemicals, the burning or chilling in this yawning gap, in this void, are eternal in the lands of the north and the south to chill and burn? Or is this claim simply false? Well, given that we have no direct revelation from the Aesir, from the Norse gods, but merely man's speculation to form conclusions on, we have every reason to believe that this is true, or rather the only reason to believe this is true, apart from what was thought by those living thousands of years ago as people tried to make a living for themselves in northern Europe, where the more north you went, it was cold, but the more south you got, the warmer it got. So you can come to an idea of what made them, human beings, speculating about the universe, would think this, but does that fall in line with reality? Is that telling it how it is? Is that true? Understand, they conflict with reality. So one of two things need to be done. We either have to dismiss them or go through the reasons we have to trust these individuals who saw it for themselves. Unfortunately, we have no reason to trust these claims apart from familial honor. And while I'm all for honoring my father and mother in regards to the Judeo-Christian ethic, unfortunately, I don't take that so far as to say I'm going to respect my parents so much so to the point that I'll only believe something they say when I know and can confirm that it is not true. That either Goinga the yawning gap, is a cold, hard vacuum, a void, and I mean cold not in the chemical sense, but just in the absolute voided sense, or I'm going to have to go through the reasons and say, you know what, regardless of what we understand about the nature of the universe, what is understood from both secular and Christian sources, that in the beginning God was the one who created the heavens and the earth, that the earth was without form and void, and only upon God's introduction to this time, and only upon that source, can we actually find a cause big enough to cause this universe, a cause willing to create this universe, thus having a will, a being or a cause that is capable of creating and maintaining the universe, who was smart enough to create a universe that worked, who was before space, time, and matter, thus spaceless, doesn't take up any material space, timeless, thus eternal, and of course, who is without physical form, who would be spirit without matter. All of these things are necessary assumptions to make, but unfortunately the claims aren't made or even answered in the Norse myths. And so we don't have a consistent claim about the nature of the universe that would fall in line with reality, and it's not a claim that I could take. But on the other hand, and this is where we're going to be gracious towards those who believe in Odinism, we have to at least take at face value the fact that even though our modern understandings of philosophy, the nature of the universe, cosmology, and all that will and could be incomplete, we always will have something more to learn, that will someday reveal, and it could someday reveal, that there are in fact 9 realms, that there are in fact Aesir, that there are, or the realms noting, but that these gods are in fact real. Well, then I have to take that into consideration. So I'll look instead of the cosmology, which is incoherent, but now look at the concept of the deities of Odinism. Are they coherent? Well, unfortunately not, and here's why. The moral dilemma that polytheism of any kind, and we can apply this to Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, Aztec mythology, whichever you'd prefer, really puts us in is to throw out morality, and that's not something I'm willing to do. Because the core assumption of Asatru is that man is basically good, thus the foundation for what is right, as opposed to what is wrong. Because understand this, and I'll clarify in a moment. When we're talking about our union with the gods, when we're talking about this concept of good as to what Asatru is trying to claim, it actually ends up throwing it out the moment that you not only introduce more than one god, but even sadder, when you introduce the type of gods we're introduced to, especially the main ones, in Odinism. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, before I get into the actions and fundamental natures of Odin, Freya, Loki, and Balder, just as our examples, in this study, I want to first clarify what I mean by God and what I mean by morality. God isn't a species, it's a title. The maximally great being in 98% of the circles that you're going to discuss it with. And this means that if you bear this title, you will be maximally powerful, maximally knowledgeable, eternal, and morally perfect. Now, some of you may already be perking up and saying, well, Odin would fall into the line of having great knowledge, so would that mean that he'd classify as God? I know he had a beginning. He was produced from the sweat glands of Ymir. But don't ask. But when we're talking about this issue, we also then have to ask ourselves this. What other ways could you use the term for God? Well, it could also be referring to someone with power. For instance, in the Old Testament, the book of Judges is the term Elohim, which is synonymous for the gods. And in the Psalms, for instance, it refers to the kings and leaders of Israel, the judges, as the gods. But unfortunately, this is not in the same way and in the same sense that we mean the God of the Bible, or the God that would be the foundational and fundamental question we want answered as far as what is right and what isn't. Because a morally perfect being is what we would look to say what is right and what is wrong. And that's one of the 3 questions we want to know when we discuss any religion. Because understand this, the founding of Odinism, or Asatru, or whatever you want to call it, are all based on whether or not Snorri Sturluson properly compiled these texts, these poems, and that the governments of Northern Europe and the Americas didn't make a mistake when recognizing it as a religion in 1973. If this is a legitimate religion, then it should answer at least these questions: our origins, our meaning, and our morality. Destiny can follow through, which we already addressed, but are these the sort of things that the gods of Odinism, or at least the chief god, which generally people would assume is Odin, others would claim it's Freya, Balder, or Loki, hopefully not the last, but you understand the point that's being made. Are these questions being answered? Is this the kind of being, or are these the kind of beings that we should refer to as God in the religious sense, rather than the governmental sense? Because I'm all for, Thor from the Avengers, it's just a being with power, or that concept, the way that Stan Lee presented them, that is reasonable. If you were to call them a god, I understand you mean God in that way. But this is a religious claim. And thus, in a religion, I'm asking myself, is this an actual standard that I could hold myself to in life? Is there a standard objectively or at all? And this, unfortunately, is the problem, because when you say that man is inherently good, you have to say, okay, well, if man is good, then what is not good? What are things that man shouldn't be doing? And that would be included in Odinism. Well, to get that answer, you'd look to the example of who? The gods. But this is where then we fall into our second problem, because understand this as well. Evil isn't a thing on its own. It's the absence of good. To then call someone good in the God sense of the term would either be exclusive to that God, or it would be non-existent because the gods cancel each other out. And what do I mean by that? Well, you have to ask yourself the question. We generally call the belief of the Norse deities Odinism, if not Asatru. Is Odin absolutely good? Does he set the standard and imperative for what is morally perfect apart from the prerogatives due only to him and him alone? And no, I'm not saying that we all have to take out our eyes, but what would be an action? What would be an example that was set by us or set for us by Odin? Well, what was the first thing that he did after coming into this world? Apart from growing, he committed patricide against his father Ymir. And while the circumstances of his birth were unique, understand, killing your father and then using his bones and corpse to shape the earth, that is not something that I would consider morally imperative. But understand, we're not here to talk about my opinion. I just want you to understand this. Odin's example includes the good, the bad, and the ugly. And unless the only things Odin did were only good, and thus not bad or ugly, and not by my opinion, but by his own standard and example, we have to ask ourselves another question. Do the other beings that bear the title of God fall in line with this? Say, for instance, Loki, who was, well, yeah, I don't even really have to provide any sources for this, but it's self-explanatory. The god of mischief, a person, a being, a deity, an Aesir, who was deceptive and manipulative in the malicious sense, as a rule. Now I ask myself, did Odin fall in line with that standard? Is Loki the absolute standard for right and wrong? Could he be called God in a religious sense? I don't deny that he had power. We could refer to him as a god in that way. But when you say that Odinism is a religion, you ask yourself, is a standard being set? How about Balder? No, I don't mean the Balder as he was presented in God of War. But understand, according to Gylfaginning, and again, I don't claim to have these pronounced properly, but you can check this out in the Eddas. He put himself deliberately in harm's way and survived to entertain his fellow Aesir. And unfortunately, his bride and brother was handed a mistletoe dart by Loki, and that ended up killing him. But is that action, is that example, something that we would consider morally perfect, especially since he was considered the god of light? Well, unfortunately, this is not something that was either A, properly modeled by all of humanity, thus making us all evil, or modeled by any of the Aesir, thus if you call Balder God, that would also make them evil for not following Balder's example. What about Freya, the goddess of fertility? Well, according to Lokasenna, Lokasena, chapter 1, verse 26 and 30 through 32, we have multiple reports of her not only being infidelitas, to committing adultery with the other gods when her husband was supposed to be Odin, and in Odin's absence, even sleeping with the gods that took over his role. But this wasn't limited to just those in charge. She was reported to have had sexual intercourse with every single one of the gods, including that of her brother Frigg. So let me then ask you this question. If Freya is the one whom we form our standards from, would infidelity, incest, and hedonism as a principle, the pursuit of pleasure in the sexual sense above all others, be something we would consider perfectly good? You can let me know when you have that conversation with your husband or wife. But understand this. Why is this a problem? Not because of my opinion or view of these actions. I need to hold these things to their own standard. To Odin, Balder, and Freya, Loki is objectively evil because they were all not deceptive by nature, at least not to the degree that Loki was. Balder put himself in harm's way to entertain his fellow Aesir. Is this something that Odin, Freya, or Loki ever did? Not to the same extent. Odin pursued knowledge above all else. Freya willingly allowed herself not to know things, and even going so far as to change the way things were. Even when she had access to the information from her fellow Aesir Frigg, she chose not to know things when she could. That is in direct conflict with the nature of Odin. Balder never pursued the knowledge of Freya's bargains with everything but mistletoe. This is objectively in conflict with the nature of Odin. Loki didn't care to know the full consequences of the children that he brought into this world, Ragnarok, nor did he care. All these things, all these traits, between and apart from each other, are objectively evil, thus making them all lacking the very thing which makes them worthy of being called God. Is this clear? Because there is such a thing as right, because I believe that it is objectively wrong not to torture babies for fun, that applies to all people at all times in all sense of the term. Not one right or two, not two rights or three rights or 50 different rights, but one objective standard that applies to all people at all places at all times. They are fundamentally in conflict with each other, especially because I recognize that chemicals aren't eternal or divine in any sense. They have a starting and an ending point, and to claim they existed before the universe in these realms of burning and cold aren't in line with reality, and because I don't have reason to trust material compiled thousands of years after the publicly verifiable miracle of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, not Balder's, I do not believe in Odinism. You've heard my reasons, and so I ask that you would come to your own conclusions with them. But I want to thank you all for your time, for at least taking the time to listen to this study. If you have questions, we'd like to provide more source material, perhaps access to the translations that I accessed, or if you have your own reasons for believing Odinism or other beliefs for that matter, and want to engage with me, that's the whole reason this ministry exists. When I'm talking about movies, when I'm talking about video games, when I'm talking about TV shows, my goal is to engage with fans. And there's nothing that we should be more fanatical about than the core and fundamental reasons we call things right and wrong. So if you are an Odinist or a follower of Asatru, if you are a believer in anything other than Christianity, understand I don't hate you. I want to talk with you, to learn from you, and hopefully return the same. But with this in mind, I also want you to understand that I'm not sharing this information with you because I hate you or want you to be embarrassed by these things. I want you to know the truth. I want you to know that while there are reasons for me not to believe Odinism, that I have every reason to believe Christianity, and I hope that you take the time to hear those out as well. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you. Feel free to share this with anyone you know that believes Odinism and could give me the kind of conversation that I'd like to have with those that I call my brothers in humanity and even my fellow Vikings. But I want you all to understand this more than anything else. Jesus loves you, and he wants you to know more than just what your parents believed. He wants you to know what is true. That's what he offers, and I do not find that Odinism offers that at all. Thank you all for your time.